The account presented by the ledger was one narrative, 250 souls present and accounted for during the dawn roll call on March 14, 1847. The same ledger, when reviewed at dusk on that identical day, presented an entirely different narrative. 0. Not having fled, not having perished, simply no longer present, as if their existence had never been. The Riverside Plantation occupied 4,000 acres of Virginia bottomland, its perimeters defined by the James River to the eastern side and dense pine woodland to the western approach. For 32 years, it had functioned with mechanical exactness under the Harrow family's control, yielding tobacco and corn in amounts that enriched Richmond merchants. The plantation's documentation was meticulous. Each bushel, each birth, each death recorded in volumes bound in leather preserved in the main residence's book collection. These records would subsequently become evidence in one of the most puzzling inquiries in pre-Civil War Virginia's history. What renders this situation remarkable is not merely the quantity of individuals who vanished. It's the thoroughness of their disappearance. 250 persons, males, females, youngsters, the aged, gone within a single 60-minute period, abandoning no tracks in the soil, no damaged enclosures, no taken supplies. The overseer's daily log, kept in the Virginia Historical Society archives, contains a solitary notation for March 14. All dwellings discovered vacant during evening check. No indications of disruption, no clarification. Prior to continuing with the narrative of what transpired at Riverside Plantation and the decades-long puzzle that ensued, comprehend this. What you're about to hear has been intentionally concealed from historical documentation. The investigation that followed included state authorities, federal law officers, and private agents retained by insurance firms who had guaranteed the plantation's substantial worth. Their conclusions were never released. The papers were restricted. The witnesses who spoke openly were discredited and the settlement that was supposedly established by those who vanished. It survived for less than 3 years before it too disappeared from maps and recollection. This is the narrative of how 250 persons achieved the impossible and why the reality was concealed for more than 100 years. To comprehend what transpired at Riverside, you must first comprehend what it was. The plantation had been founded in 1815 by William Harrow's father, Thomas, who had obtained the property from a tobacco dealer who had encountered financial difficulties. The elder Harrow had been a systematic individual, fixated on efficiency and documentation. He had created the plantation's configuration himself, situating the dwellings in a spot that could be watched from the main residence, guaranteeing that the work structures were organized for peak output and establishing patterns that governed every element of plantation existence. When William took over the property in 1835, he preserved his father's methods with unwavering dedication. Each morning started with attendance check at 6 o'clock. Each evening concluded with an examination of the dwellings at 8. Food was provided at set times. Work duties were listed on a board outside the overseer's residence. Penalties for violations were recorded in a separate volume with dates, offenses, and results noted in William's meticulous penmanship. The main residence was a 3-level construction of red brick with white pillars holding up an extensive veranda that extended around 3 directions. From the upper floor windows, one could observe across the whole plantation. The dwellings to the northern side, the tobacco fields to the southern side, the cornfields to the western side, and the river shining at a distance to the eastern side. William's workspace occupied the southeast corner of the upper floor, positioned so he could observe both the dwellings and the main work zones without departing his desk. Catherine Harrow, William's spouse, managed the household activities with comparable exactness. She had been raised on a plantation in South Carolina and brought with her definite notions about how a household ought to be managed. The main residence staff consisted of 12 persons who resided in a separate structure behind the kitchen. Cooks, household workers, a head servant, a laundry worker, and personal attendants for the household members. Catherine maintained her own collection of records documenting the household's daily operations in a series of journals that she had kept since her marriage in 1828. The Harrow offspring, William Jr., age 32, Thomas, age 29, and Elizabeth, age 26, had all been raised on the plantation and had absorbed their parents' attitudes and methods. William Jr. managed the tobacco operation. Thomas supervised the corn production and animals, and Elizabeth, unmarried and residing at home, assisted her mother with household management and served as the plantation's informal educator for the family's younger relatives and the children of nearby plantation owners. By all accounts, the Harrows considered themselves progressive owners. They supplied sufficient food and attire, permitted religious gatherings in the chapel each Sunday, and seldom used the harshest forms of punishment that were typical on other estates. William frequently remarked to guests that a properly treated laborer is a productive laborer, and he believed his plantation's steady profitability demonstrated the wisdom of this method. What the Harrows neglected to recognize, what they were inherently unable to recognize, was that underneath the surface of compliance and routine, an entirely separate realm existed. A realm of murmured exchanges, encoded messages, and careful preparation. A realm that had been developing toward March 14, 1847 for years. The population of Riverside in early 1847 was remarkably varied, a result of Thomas Harrow's buying practices and William's subsequent acquisitions. This variety would prove essential to what happened, though the Harrows never comprehended why. Among the oldest inhabitants was a man named Samuel, who had been born in Africa and transported to America in 1804 before the legal importation of enslaved people was banned. He was in his 60s by 1847. His hair completely white, his frame bent from decades of labor, yet his intellect remained sharp, and he served as an informal elder and counselor to the community. Samuel spoke multiple African languages and functioned as a link between the African-born inhabitants and those born in America. He also possessed understanding of herbal medicine, navigation by celestial bodies, and oral history preservation, abilities that would prove precious. Then there was Marcus, the lead carpenter, who had been bought from a Baltimore estate in 1829. Marcus was 53 years old in 1847, a man of average height with robust shoulders and hands marked from years of working with wood and metal. He had been instructed by a skilled artisan in Baltimore and possessed abilities that extended far beyond simple carpentry. He could comprehend architectural drawings, calculate structural weights, and resolve complex engineering issues. The Harrows valued him highly for his capacity to construct and fix buildings, furniture, and tools. They had no awareness that he had been employing those same abilities for an entirely different objective. Marcus had a wife, Hannah, and 3 children. 2 daughters, Rachel and Sarah, ages 19 and 16, and a son, David, age 14. Hannah worked in the main residence as a seamstress, a role that gave her entry to information about the family's schedules and guests. Rachel and Sarah worked in the fields during planting and harvest seasons, and in the main residence during winter months. David worked in the carpentry workshop with his father, acquiring the trade. Dinina, the head cook, was 46 years old and had been at Riverside since 1833. She had been bought from a Virginia estate after her previous owner died and his possessions were sold. Dinina was a woman of considerable intelligence and forceful character. She managed a kitchen staff of 4 and was accountable for feeding not only the Harrow family, but also preparing the communal meals for the dwellings. This gave her authority over food supplies and the capacity to redirect resources without causing suspicion. She was also one of the few persons who could travel freely between the main residence and the dwellings at nearly any time, transporting messages and information under the cover of her responsibilities. Benjamin the stable worker was 21 years old and had been born on the plantation. He was the son of a woman named Grace who had died in childbirth when Benjamin was born. He had been raised collectively by the community with no single parent figure, which had given him a certain autonomy of spirit that the overseer found troublesome. Benjamin was accountable for maintaining the plantation's horses, and for operating the wagon on journeys to Richmond and neighboring towns to buy supplies or deliver goods. These journeys had given him understanding of roads, settlements, and the wider geography of Virginia that few others at Riverside possessed. There was also a woman named Esther, age 38, who worked as a midwife and healer. She had been born in South Carolina and bought by William Harrow in 1840. Esther had learned medicine from her mother and grandmother, and she possessed extensive understanding of herbs, treatments for common ailments, and the management of childbirth. She was trusted by both the enslaved community and to some extent by the Harrow family, who occasionally consulted her when their own physicians were unavailable. This trust gave her a measure of freedom of movement and access to information that others lacked. Among the younger generation was a man named Joseph, age 27, who worked in the blacksmith's workshop. Joseph had been bought from a Maryland estate in 1842, and brought with him abilities in metalwork that made him valuable to the plantation's operations. He could fix tools, shoe horses, and create metal components for tools and buildings. He was quiet and kept mainly to himself, which led the Harrows to consider him simple-minded. Actually, Joseph was highly intelligent and had been using his position to create tools and implements that would be needed for purposes the Harrows never imagined. There were many others, each with their own abilities, knowledge, and roles in the community. There was Ruth, a woman in her 50s, who arranged the Sunday religious services and maintained the chapel. There was Jacob, a man in his 40s who managed the vegetable gardens that enhanced the community's diet. There was Miriam, a young woman of 23 who worked in the main residence and had taught herself to read by secretly studying books in the Harrow library. There was Thomas, not to be confused with Thomas Harrow, a man in his 30s who worked in the tobacco fields and had an extensive knowledge of the surrounding forests from years of hunting to enhance the community's food supply. Each of these individuals and dozens of others had been carefully watched and assessed by Marcus, Dinina, Samuel, and a small central group who had been preparing the escape for years. Each had been given specific roles based on their abilities, knowledge, and dependability, and each had been preparing in their own manner for the night of March 13, 1847. The preparation for the escape had started in the winter of 1842 to 1843, though its origins extended even further back. The trigger had been a discussion between Marcus and Samuel, the two oldest and most esteemed men in the community. It had been a cold January night, and Marcus had been working late in his workshop, repairing a wagon wheel by lamplight. Samuel had appeared at the entrance, moving quietly despite his age, and had asked if they could talk privately. What followed was a discussion that would change the direction of 250 lives. Samuel had begun by asking Marcus a simple question. If you could depart this place, where would you go? Marcus had been surprised by the directness of the question. Such discussions were dangerous. Even speaking of escape could lead to severe punishment if overheard. Yet something in Samuel's manner suggested this was not casual speculation. North, Marcus had replied carefully. To a free state, Pennsylvania, maybe further. Samuel had nodded slowly. And how would you get there? I don't know. The roads are watched. The river is patrolled. And even if I made it, I'm one man. What about Hannah? What about my children? What if it wasn't just you? Samuel had asked. What if it was all of us? Marcus had stared at the elderly man, trying to decide if he was serious or if age had finally impacted his judgment. All of us? That's impossible. 250 people can't just disappear. Where would we go? How would we travel? How would we eat? Those are good questions, Samuel had said. Questions that need answers. But first answer this. Is it impossible because it truly cannot be done? Or is it impossible because we've been taught to believe it cannot be done? That discussion had planted a seed. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself thinking about Samuel's question. He began to examine the plantation with fresh eyes, not as a place where he was confined, but as a problem to be solved. How were they contained? What were the actual obstacles to escape? What resources did they have access to? What knowledge did they possess collectively that could be applied to the problem? He began to have quiet discussions with others he trusted. Dinina, who controlled food supplies. Benjamin, who knew the roads and territory. Joseph, who could create tools. Esther, who understood medicine and could treat injuries or illness during a journey. Ruth, who could arrange and motivate people. Each discussion was careful, indirect, never stating the ultimate goal explicitly, but determining whether the person could be trusted and what they might contribute. By the spring of 1843, a central group of about 15 people had formed. They met in small groups, never all together, usually during the Sunday religious services when conversation was expected and less likely to be monitored. They began to develop what would eventually become the plan. The first major decision was about destination. The initial assumption had been that they would flee north to free states or Canada. Yet as they discussed the practicalities, the difficulties became evident. The distance was enormous, hundreds of miles. The route would take them through populated areas where they would be noticeable. Even if they reached free territory, they would be fugitives subject to recapture under federal law, and the journey would be especially difficult for the elderly, the very young, and the unwell. It was Samuel who proposed the alternative. What if we didn't run away? What if we disappeared? The distinction seemed subtle, yet it was essential. Running away meant fleeing to somewhere else, somewhere known, somewhere that could be followed. Disappearing meant vanishing so completely that pursuit would be impossible because no one would know where to search. Where can 250 people disappear to? Marcus had asked. Somewhere no one would think to search, Samuel had replied. Somewhere close. Somewhere in Virginia itself. The idea seemed ridiculous at first. Virginia was slave territory. Remaining in Virginia meant remaining in danger. Yet as Samuel explained his thinking, the reasoning became clear. Everyone would anticipate them to flee north. Resources would be directed towards searching northern routes. If they instead went west into the mountains and found a remote location where they could establish themselves, they might remain concealed long enough to organize a more permanent solution. Benjamin, who had traveled through the western parts of Virginia on supply runs, confirmed that there were vast stretches of mountainous territory that were thinly populated and difficult to reach. There are valleys in those mountains that no one ever goes to, he said. Too remote for farming, too rough for roads. If we could find one of those valleys, we could hide there. This became the foundation of the plan. Escape from Riverside, travel west to the mountains, establish a concealed settlement, and use that as a base while they organize the next phase, whatever that might be. Yet this still left the enormous problem of how to actually escape from Riverside. The plantation was not a prison, yet it was controlled. The dwellings were enclosed. The gates were secured at night. Subscribe the channel.